It's often said that the hard problem of consciousness was brought to the world's attention first by David Chalmers in 1995. I recently came across a passage in the Gospel of Thomas. It's a Coptic text discovered in Egypt in 1945 that attributes the hard problem to Jesus. The Gospel is a collection of the sayings of Jesus. It probably dates to about the 2nd century AD. And here's the relevant passage. Jesus said, "If the flesh came into existence because of the Spirit, it is a marvel. But if the Spirit came into existence because of the body, it is a marvel of marvels. I wonder at this, how this great wealth made its home in this poverty." And that's the problem we all continue to marvel at. How does the mind come into existence because of the brain? How does the great wealth of conscious experience emerge from the poverty of the material brain? The spectre of an unbridgeable explanatory gap continues to haunt the field of consciousness studies. And to judge from Francois Camera's presentation, it still lurks at the back of the minds of contemporary illusionists. Francois, in that chapter he sent us, I think it says 6 times in the first 8 pages that consciousness does not exist. Now, why should he want to say that consciousness does not exist? If it's not that he can't accept that such a marvelous thing could possibly exist. I think conscious illusionists are running scared that they might be wrong. The illusionist solution, of course, is a bold one. It is in a brave attempt to make the hard problem go away. They make the non-existence of phenomenal consciousness a premise of their theory. They assert that phenomenal properties are not just hard to explain in terms of physical laws, but incompatible with them. So anyone who claims phenomenal consciousness is real must be under an illusion. Well, I was an illusionist myself for many years. Here I am in a video for the Royal Institution in 2011, explaining how being phenomenally conscious is rather like looking at Richard Gregory's real impossible triangle. We think we perceive the triangle, but we don't really. We think we experience the qualia of sensation, but we don't really. We're being tricked by some strange object inside our brain. And I guess I was partly responsible for recruiting Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish to the cause. I remember 25 years ago trying to persuade Dan to take radical illusionism seriously as the only possible way of avoiding the hard problem. But I've now changed my mind. I now think that for my part, I took fright too easily. What if the explanatory gap is in fact a mirage? What if, when our brains represent sensations as having phenomenal properties, they're getting it right? What if our subjective feelings about sensory stimuli, red light at our eyes, the sting of a bee, the smell of a rose, what if these feelings have the very properties that we think they do, without there being any clash with physical theory? Well, then, of course, it's game over for the hard problem. But it's game over for illusionism, too. Illusionism will no longer be needed as a theory of last resort to explain away an impossible problem, leaving room for a more interesting, positive interpretation of what phenomenal consciousness is actually all about. So that's my goal, to provide a scientific account of sensations that explains within a physicalist framework how they really have phenomenal properties, and then to say something about what makes these properties so unique and, yes, marvelous. So to be clear at the start about what I mean by sensations, I hope I can assume in this company of this conference that sensations are indeed nothing other than mental representations. They are intentional states with an intentional object. The intentional object of my sensations, what they are about, is what's happening to me. It's the sensory stimulation at my body surface and how I, as a subject, evaluate it. It's about my relationship to the stimulus and how what it means to me. It's not about the stimulus, pure and simple. Now, how is this representation done in the brain? How do we represent this very important fact of our lives, of our relationship to the external world? Well, as with any kind of representation, we can assume that it has to involve a two-stage process. In the case of seeing red, for example, there will be, to start with, the physical vehicle that carries the information about how the brain evaluates the light arriving at the eyes. And secondly, the cognitive interpretation that interprets this as the idea of phenomenal redness. By analogy, let's consider a work of literature, say the novel Moby Dick. There will be, to begin with, the text that carries the information about the words penned by the author. And then there'll be the cognitive operation that interprets these as a story about a white whale. And let's note, this is important in relation to the hard problem and the explanatory gap, that there's nothing in the physical text that is white or whale-like. And so by the same token, we can presume there's going to be nothing in the brain's physical response to light that is phenomenally red. Here, let me show it as an illustration. First, the book. So we have the written text, then the reading of the text, and finally, the interpretation of the text as the story of a white whale. Now, the case of the brain seeing red. First, the brain text, then the reading of it, then the interpretation of this as of a phenomenally red sensation. No actual redness in the brain, just the idea of redness and our relationship to it. So our task as scientists has to be to work out just how the brain achieves this feat of representing phenomenal properties, how the wealth of the story marvelously emerges from the poverty of the text. Well, the way I've approached it as an evolutionary psychologist has been by forward engineering, and some in this audience have heard my story of this before, but I'm going to run through it briefly. So that's to say, I've begun with the end product, sensations as humans experience them today, but rather than treating this, as theorists typically do, as something to deconstruct, I've treated it as something to invent. I've tried to come up with an evolutionary sequence that gets us from the experiential nothingness of our primitive ancestors to the phenomenal somethingness we enjoy today. The sequence I've arrived at has several. How can I turn this off, by the way? Does one of these turn off? Well, I don't go on looking at the screen. The sequence I've arrived at has several twists and turns. Some of you have certainly heard me say this before, but I hope you won't mind me telling you again. I believe sensations originated as active behavioral responses to stimuli arriving at the body's surface. They were something the subject did about the stimulation long before they evolved to be something the subject felt about it. So imagine a primitive amoeba-like, I should say, animal floating in the ancient seas. Stuff happens to it. Light falls on its body. Pressure waves press against it. Chemicals stick to it. Some of these events are going to be good for the animal. Others are going to be bad. If it's to survive, it must evolve the ability to sort out the good from the bad and to respond differently, reacting to this stimulus with an ouch and to that perhaps with a whoopee. I call these expressive responses that evaluate the input sentition. It's meant to be a mixture somehow between sensation and volition. It's an active response. To start with, these responses are entirely local responses, wriggles of acceptance or rejection, organized around the site of stimulation. When, say, red light falls on the animal makes a characteristic wriggle of activity. It wriggles redly. When salt arrives, it makes a different kind of wriggle. It wriggles saltily. Before long, the responses come to be mediated by a central ganglion or proto-brain. Now, presumably, sentition has been designed by natural selection to be adaptive. with each response taking account of what kind of stimulus is reaching the body surface and what import it has for the animal's well-being. Thus, even from the earliest stage, we could say that the animal is enacting what the stimulation means to it. Yet, to begin with, the responses are entirely reflex, and none of this meaning is being held in mind. Let's imagine, however, that as the animal's life becomes more complex, it reaches a stage where it would benefit from retaining some kind of mental record of what's affecting it, a representation of the stimulus that can serve as a basis for planning and decision-making. And it turns out there's a very neat way of achieving this. To discover what's happening to me, the animal has only to monitor what I'm doing about it. And it can do this by the simple trick of creating a copy of the command signals for the responses, an efference copy that can be read in reverse to recreate the meaning of the simulation. In short, the animal can begin to get a feel for the stimulus by accessing the information already implicit in its own response. And this, I believe, is the precursor of subjective sensation. But of course, it will not first be sensation as we humans know it. It won't have any special phenomenal quality. The key to acquiring phenomenal properties lies in how sentition goes on evolving. In the early days, it does involve overt bodily behavior out in the open. But there must come a time when such overt behavior is no longer appropriate. The animal no longer wants to recoil reflexly from red light, for example, but it still wants to register that red light is falling on its body and that it feels menacing. So what to do about that? The solution natural selection hits on is ingenious. It is for the responses to become internalized or privatized. What happens is that the command signals, rather than bringing about actual motor behavior, begin to target the internal body map where the sense organs project to the brain. In this way, sentition evolves to be a virtual bodily response, yet still an activity that can be read to provide a mental representation of the stimulation that elicits it. Now, as luck would have it, this privatization has a wonderful result. To illustrate what happens, let me switch to something more like a full-scale human brain. Here we have sentition, the evaluative body response. Here the efference copy is being monitored by a proto-self, the new subject of sensation. And here now the response is being privatized. And what's the result? It leads to a feedback loop between motor and sensory regions of the brain, a loop with the potential to sustain recursive activity, going round and round, catching its own tail. And I believe this development is game-changing. Crucially, it means the activity can be drawn out in time, so as to give rise to the thick moment of sensation. But more than this, the activity can be channeled and stabilized so as to create a mathematically complex attractor state, a dynamic pattern of activity that recreates itself. Now, such an attractor can, in theory, have remarkable hyperdimensional properties, real, unreal, magical. The answer is going to be in the eye of the beholder. Small adjustments to the circuitry will result in dramatic changes to the attractor's shape, with corresponding changes in the subjective experience. And the upshot is, at least in the line that led to humans, the upshot is the creation of a very special kind of attractor, one the subject reads as having the feel of phenomenal qualia. Now, this attractor is still a type of sentition, which originates as a response to sensory stimulation, and it still carries information about what's happening to me. But the information now comes clothed in out-of-this-world magical properties. Well, where did this get our ancestors, and where millions of years later has it got human beings today? I believe we experience every day the results of this selection for magic in our heads. Every time we look at the blue sky, every time we smell a rose. We now live in an enchanted world. But this is by no means all. What's come to pass is that sensations now play a double role. While on one level still connecting us to the material world, they serve also to distance us from it. They give us the feeling that there is an essential non-physical dimension to our lives. They fix our sense of self as a bubble of spiritual substance floating in a world of things. Consciousness becomes for us what in essence we feel we are. But some no doubt are going to object, isn't this just illusionism under another name? No, it's not, because we've ended up with something, a way of being in the world, that is not necessarily an illusion. According to the Oxford Dictionary, I don't need that one yet, but anyway, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, an illusion is an instance of a wrong or misinterpreted perception, a deceptive appearance or impression, a false idea or belief. Illusions are defined by what's wrong with them. But if we take phenomenal consciousness seriously as we obviously should do, surely we should do it the honor of defining it by what's right with it. And given what sensations are about, our personal evaluation of our body's interaction with sensory stimuli, there's every reason to accept that phenomenal's properties provide an accurate description of what this feels like as a psychological state. And they provide a good guide to the effects on our attitudes and our behavior, as Dan would say, as a guide to then what happens. So that explains why I've called my talk Consciousness as Art. What I want to suggest is that we should think of phenomenal consciousness not as an illusion, but as a stroke of artistic genius. And without giving up on my theory about attractors in the brain, I want to put a positive new spin on it. And there's my picture. When we have a conscious sensation, when we see red or taste a lemon, we're creating something like a cubist painting. Not so much a misrepresentation as an artistic re-representation of the facts. And in the next few minutes, I want to see where we can go with this. I'm going to draw on what several artists themselves have said about what makes art special. So much more than an illusion, and therefore potentially such a good analogy for consciousness. First of all, works of art are essentially the personal creation of the artist. Delacroix writes in his journal, those things which are most real to me are the illusions I create in my painting. Then advising a student about where to begin, he writes, oh, young artist, you want to be a subject? You want a subject? Everything is a subject. The subject is yourself. They are your impressions, your emotions before nature. You must look within yourself and not around yourself. Art comes from within you. The work must represent your take on things, your impressions before nature. And likewise, sensations are our own doing. We're expressing our active feeling for sensory stimulation. Now, it's true that Delacroix used the word illusion, but not in any negative sense. The work of art, far from being a deceptive impression, is a self-revealing one. As Picasso puts it, art is a lie that makes us realize truth. Through art, we express our conception of what nature is not. The artist's departure from truth are not mistakes, but they're rather deliberate extensions to physical reality. When Van Gogh was criticized for the errors in his painting of the potato eaters, he replied, what I want most to do is to make of these incorrectnesses, deviations, remodelings, or adjustments of reality, something that may be untrue, but is at the same time more true than the truth. Sensations, likewise, involve us in transforming and embellishing the information arriving at our sense organs so as to reveal what it feels like for us. Paul Klee said, art does not reproduce the visible, rather it makes visible. And by the same token, sensations bring to light aspects of our own nature that we'd otherwise be blind to. Samuel Palmer puts it beautifully. Bits of nature are generally much improved by being received into the soul. Now, of course, there's no single answer as to the kind of improvement that the artist aspires to, but Picasso has a suggestion that I'd say comes as near as can be to summarizing what art in general is about. He called it super-realism. He didn't mean the surrealism of the surrealist movement, as in the paintings of Salvador Dali, which Picasso considered childish. He meant its antithesis. As he says, Picasso said, the surrealists never understood what I intended when I invented the word. I meant something more real than reality. Resemblance is what I'm after, a resemblance that's deeper and more real than the real. When discussing his great sculpture of a goat, he claims, she's more like a goat than a real goat, don't you think? Well, yes, we can all agree she is. She's goatier than a real goat. But how so? Because she's a goat plus feeling, a goat received into the soul. Van Gogh's chair is more like a chair than a real chair. Monet's cathedral is more like a cathedral than a real cathedral. Susan Aldworth's painting of a brain is more like a brain than a real brain. A real brain, of course, is extraordinarily uninteresting as an object in itself. And now I'll say it, that the impossible triangle is more triangular than a real triangle. And phenomenal red is redder than real physical red. And when it comes to a theory of consciousness, as I said, I don't like the term illusionism. I think we do much better to talk about phenomenal surrealism. And here's my suggestion of that in the paper responding to Keith Frankish. Now, speaking of super properties, of super real, here's one more grand quote about art from the philosopher of Superman. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "Art is not merely an imitation of the reality of nature, but a metaphysical supplement to the reality of nature. We have art in order not to die of the truth. Art isn't merely an imitation of nature, it's a metaphysical supplement to the reality of nature." I said earlier that I believe one of the purposes of phenomenal consciousness is that it enlarges our own self-worth, our sense of our own metaphysical significance. And so here's my riff on nature, on Nietzsche. Conscious sensations are a metaphysical supplement to the physical world. We have phenomenal consciousness in order not to die of the truth of materialism. Well, I've left myself, I hope, a few minutes. I don't have a watch on here, but I want to use it to give an example of how thinking of consciousness as art can be more than a revealing metaphor. I want to show how it can throw light on an enduring philosophical and psychological problem about the continuity of the self, which has been raised several times in our meeting already. It's a problem that I would call Alice's problem. Alice in Wonderland, having gone down the rabbit hole, you'll remember, had a series of disconcerting adventures that made her begin to doubt her own identity. I wonder if I've been changed in the night, she muses. Let me think, was I the same when I got up this morning? But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? And she began thinking over all the children she knew who were the same age as she was, to see if she could think for whom she might have been changed in the night. And it's a puzzle that bothered the great philosopher, David Hume. Hume recognized, of course, that sensations lie at the heart of the self. For my part, he wrote, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception of heat or some sensation of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. When my sensations are removed for any time as by sound sleep, I may truly be said not to exist. Hume, however, wasn't at all happy with this. He was worried that the self he'd discovered lacked character. There was nothing to bind its elements together. There is no single power of the soul, he wrote, which remains unalterably the same, perhaps for one moment, no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity in another. But as I see it, Hume was missing a crucial point about sensations. Because sensations are a personal, creative response to sensory stimulation, they will presumably bear the stylistic signature of the individual who creates them. And given that every individual has a different brain, different genes, and a different history, everyone's style is bound to be unique. So there is a part of the soul that remains the same from one occasion to the next. It's the phenomenal style of the sensations we create as artists. I like to think of it this way. Imagine that your sensations form a sequence of paintings that hang in a long gallery, stretching back into the past. Their subject matter is what's been happening at your sense organs and how you felt about it at successive moments. And the style in which your sensations are executed is peculiarly yours. We say paintings by Cézanne are all Cézanne's. Turners are all Turners. Sorry, I should have said, yes, Cézanne's are Cézanne's, Turners are Turners, Van Goghs are all Van Goghs. And so in just the same way, the works you've created throughout your life are all used. My point is that the stylistic markers common to one sensation and the next are more than sufficient to link each episode of your I to the preceding ones, and so to establish your self's continuing existence. Even when your sensations are removed for a time, as by sound sleep, you need never doubt it's the same I that picks up where it left off, because it is undoubtedly doing sensations your way. Well, I really like this idea of everyone doing sensations differently, that there are as many styles of sensation in the world as there are minds. And in this conference that's been made possible by Russian generosity, I want to end with a poem about the diversity of souls by the poet Yevtushenko. And I hope the native Russians here will forgive me for reading it in English. No people are uninteresting. Their fate is like the chronicle of planets. Nothing in them is not particular, and planet is dissimilar from planet. In any man who dies, there dies with him his first snow and kiss and fight. Not people die, but worlds die in them. And I think each of us has that legacy in the history of our sensations. And it makes me wonder what it was really like to be this person here. So thank you very much.
I first want to thank for the invitation to this wonderful event, and I would also like to thank the organizers, Pietro, Dimitri, it was a wonderful event also in this extremely beautiful town. My talk, I think, fits nicely with the previous talk, even if my approach will be a bit different. So I'm starting with the idea that we cannot explain consciousness, and I would like to focus very much on one property or one problem underlying this, or one aspect of this problem that I think is mostly thought to be the most mysterious one. And I would like to convince you that this mystery can be explained away so that we can get an understanding of this aspect. And the basic idea is that we have a long history in the history of sciences where people thought that problems they were not able to solve could not be solved. And that beyond the usual strategy of science to explain properties in terms of causes and effects, or in general in terms of what they do or what effects they have, that this strategy fails for the problem at hand. So Locke, for instance, thought, you have seen this wonderful quote from the Gnostic Gospels, yeah, that consciousness cannot explain. That's something that you find in the almost entire history of science. You find it in Plato, you find in Lucretius, De Rerum Natura, you find it later in the 17th or early 18th century in Leibniz, etc. All these people thought it's impossible to understand consciousness with the strategies we normally use in science. But it was not only consciousness. In Leibniz, in Locke, it was the idea that we cannot understand the change of physical state with the usual methods of science. That's a mystery. That Descartes thought that we cannot, and the biologists until the 19th century thought we cannot understand the difference between living and non-living beings in the usual way. And even du Barremont, who is one of the first proponents of this current formulation of the problem of consciousness, thought it's not only consciousness that's mystery, it's also the essence of matter and force. There are three in his seminal lecture on the limitations of the natural sciences. He has three mysteries. One is consciousness, and the other one is matter and force. And today we think, of course, we understand what matter and force is. And C.D. Broad, that's my last example, thought that the chemical properties, in the 1920s, chemical properties cannot be understood. Today we think we understand the chemical properties. And I would like to convince you that we can do the same with at least one of the most essential aspects of the problem of consciousness, namely the qualitative aspect, and particularly the qualitative aspect of pain. Let me explain. So just an intuitive version of this problem by Kathleen Akins. As far as I know, Kathleen Akins used to work for Daniel Dennett for a time. The problem of consciousness, simply put, is that we cannot understand how a brain core gray granular lump of biological matter could be the source or ground of our rich phenomenal lives. It makes little intuitive sense to think that any particular facts about the brain would prove helpful in this regard. Physiological facts and the puzzle of consciousness seem to pass each other by. And I would like to convince you that there is one point where these different realms fit to each other. Yeah, right. As I've already said, the intuition that consciousness cannot be explained is extremely old. There is a certain problem to talk about texts from ancient philosophy because they don't use the same concepts. Yeah? We have a strong development of concepts from the soul, the spirit. Then in the 17th century, the concept of consciousness was introduced, and the authors like Descartes weren't interested in the philosophy of mind. They were interested in epistemology. They were interested in how to found a scientific program. And consciousness was the cogito in Descartes was the founding block, or was thought to be the founding block. The certainness of the cogito was thought to be the founding block. He was not interested in the philosophy of mind. Then later you find similar versions of this problem in Leibniz, and as already said, in the 19th century. It is important to note, second, that what was thought to be most mysterious was not the qualitative character of consciousness. It was the cognitive character of consciousness, the higher cognitive abilities. Descartes wrote a book about les passions de l'âme. He thought we can understand emotions. They are part of the body, therefore we can understand them. So, and that has shifted in the 19th century. And now in the most recent debate, the idea is that the qualitative character of conscious experience is the most mysterious one. And the background of this claim, and it is mysterious because we cannot translate qualitative experience into functional terms. Functional terms, this is the language, causes and effects, that's the language of science. Now, I would like to convince you that this is possible, and one of the reasons why this hasn't been seen is that due to the background in current philosophy of mind, of behaviorism and a certain understanding of functionalism, which assumes that we have to cash out functional properties, causes and effect in terms of behavior. Therefore, that's my explanation why it hasn't already been seen. So the basic idea of the explanation why consciousness cannot be explained is because the qualitative character cannot be translated into functional terms or into causes and effects. I would like to convince you that the problem is solvable. My basic claim will be that the negative character of pain experience can be translated into functional terms. I think that I've already said one of the reasons why I think this has not been seen is this focus on, or this behavioral background, cashing out function in terms of behavior. And the second reason is that the concept of consciousness, I think, is very, very badly suited for an explanation, particularly in causes and effects. And the reason is that consciousness is not really a concept. Consciousness, as I've already said, has a completely different origin. It can be seen if you compare the terms for consciousness in the different European language: conscientia, conscience, consciousness, and Bewusstsein. There is one thing all these concepts have in common, or these terms have in common. Did you realize? It's knowledge. The idea was that consciousness is a kind of knowledge, second-order knowledge of the experiences you have. And if you have knowledge in a philosophical sense, knowledge implies truth, then you're always right about your experiences. And that means that the third-person perspective, the scientific perspective, is at a principal disadvantage. Is this point clear? Knowledge means that you're always right. If you're not right about your conscious experience, that's not conscious. Now, it would not be consciousness. If it's consciousness, then you're always right about your feelings. And then the external perspective, the third-person perspective, is always as a disadvantage. And that, I think, it's a conceptual mistake, if you want so. Yeah, building a first-person privilege into the concept, the way we describe the phenomenon we want to explain. That's one of the problems. The other problem is that we don't have any precise explananda in this idea of consciousness that then could make the subject of a causal explanation. So that's why I think it's much better to focus on more precise phenomena like pain. Okay. My talk will have three steps. I will first try to show that the problem in the end is an empirical problem, that the arguments allegedly showing that the problem is not unsolvable because it's a conceptual problem are unjustified. That's some more specific philosophical stuff, so I will only touch it, because I assume that most of you are not so much interested in technical stuff from philosophy. I will only gloss over it. Then I will focus on my hypothesis. The hypothesis is basically that subjective and objective knowledge can be connected. And this is possible particularly in the case of pain, the aversive character of pain, what is bad about pain. And my claim is having the feeling, having this aversive experience of pain implies a desire or intention or disposition to get rid of it. And there's a lot of evidence for that. That's only a hypothesis. And then I will provide in the third part intuitive and scientific evidence that this is in fact the case, that the feeling of pain is directly associated with a certain behavioral disposition. And please note that there is underlying a philosophical argument that qualitative experience are necessarily functional, which I make in the first part. That's the more technical stuff. So I don't only need empirical evidence to make my point. Okay, so let me shortly explain, and again, the philosophical expert, I will happy to answer more precise question or to give you something in writing that explains this in more detail. Basic idea, that's now a bit for the expert. So the concept of the problem of consciousness starts with an intuition that there is this gap between the phenomenal experience and scientific explanations, say, of neuroscientific processes. And the claim is that we can never connect these two realms or these two discourses in a way that neuroscientific evidence helps us to understand conscious experience. And that has been cashed out by some philosophers, among them Joe Levine, David Chalmers, Jaegwon Kim, and discussion has started with Thomas Nagel. And the basic idea is that in order to understand consciousness, we need a specific type of explanation, a reductive explanation. And what a reductive explanation makes is it helps us to understand a surface or common sense property of a certain substance or a certain system in terms of the elements of that property. So we can understand the freezing of water, if we have a reductive explanation, by referring to the properties or the behavior of H2O molecules. And then the important step is, in order to be able to do this, we have to connect our talk about the H2O molecules with talk about water. And the idea is, it is possible to give a conceptual connection such that we know that whatever we say about the behavior of H2O molecules is something we say about water. And then we can connect these two realms. It's a bit like you want an explanation for the evening star, and then you realize that the evening star, meaning talking about the evening star, is nothing else than talking about the morning star. You have evidence about the morning star, and if you know that both are the same, you can use all the evidence that you have about the morning star, or the understanding about the morning star refers to the evening star as well. And then the important point in the argument is this type of explanation does not work for phenomenal consciousness. This type of explanation does not work because it would require that we can translate talk about conscious experience into causal talk. And that does not work, into functional talk. And this is shown by thought experiment about zombies and color experiences, which all seem to show that phenomenal properties can change completely independent whatever is going on the functional or on the physical level. Is this something? So the only argument, and I think the strongest argument that you can make against this assumption, against the assumption that there is an independence between conscious experience, phenomenal experience, and what goes on in the brain on the physical level, is a version of this zombie, modified version of the zombie thought experiment. If it's possible that conscious states vary independent of physical states in the body, then it should be possible that there are part-time zombies. Part-time zombies are zombies that sometimes have normal conscious experience and at other time lack this conscious experience without any difference on the bodily level. So I might be a part-time zombie, so I could be in a zombie state right now. I could also be in a conscious state right now. And there is no way for you to identify this. Yeah, that's the basic idea. And I would like to show you that this is an absurd idea that we have to give up. And the reason is assume, so that's the changes between the different states of the part-time zombie. Okay, I hope that. Okay, right. Now, imagine at time 1, the zombie is in an unconscious state. He cuts into his finger, the pain system responds, and the memory system responds. At time 2, the zombie is in a conscious state. Everything else is completely identical. So he cuts into his finger, the pain system responds, and the memory system responds. And at time 3, maybe 2 seconds later, he reflects on these two situations, and he asks whether these situations were identical for him or whether there was any difference. What is the answer that the zombie has to give merely from the first-person perspective? From outside perspective, it's clear you cannot see any difference because physically, functionally, everything is identical. But what would be the answer for the zombie? Is the zombie able to tell the difference between the absolute? He is not, and he cannot be. He cannot be for physical reasons because his memory encodings are identical. They have to be identical because the zombie in the zombie state and the part-time zombie in the non-zombie state have to be physically and functionally identical. So the memory encodings have to be identical. So the zombie will never be able, that is now an important conclusion, to tell whether he has been in a zombie state 10 seconds ago or 5 minutes ago, or maybe his entire previous life, because that would never make a difference. And even I could be a zombie, or you could be a zombie state. Then you could be a part-time zombie. You could have spent your entire previous life until now in a zombie state, and because that doesn't make a difference, you wouldn't be able to realize that. And that seems to be an absolutely absurd consequence, which also undermines assumptions that the proponents of the explanatory gap argument make, namely that we have phenomenal knowledge. And so we have to give up this. We have to assume that phenomenal states have to be functionally relevant. That's the important point. Okay, and I would like, that's only a general premise. It doesn't show us what the functional relevance is. And now I would like to give you an example or to spell this out in more concrete terms. And again, I've already said, oh, that's the backward direction. Okay, I'll come up with a hypothesis. I've also already mentioned it, and I think this hypothesis can be or is intuitive, and it should be intuitive because it's about our own experience. And the hypothesis is that pain, particularly the negative aspect of pain, is intrinsically functional. Feeling negative pain, feeling a terrible pain, just is wanting to get rid of it. That's the claim. And that's part of this feeling. And if that would not be the case, then pain wouldn't be evolutionary adaptive. Yeah? We have to assume this. And I think it doesn't only hold for pain. So the claim is subjective experience of pain entails an urge to avoid, to get rid of it or to avoid it. Now, claim is that this specific type of phenomenal experience, negative pain, implies this urge to avoid. And this urge to avoid is a functional property or a functional experience. It entails the disposition, the conscious disposition. You want that and you know that you want it. And at the same time, it's a phenomenal experience. So it's phenomenal and functional at the same time. And keep in mind, and I will explain this in a bit more detail later, that this cognitive function is not directly cashed out in behavior. So you may have this bad feeling of pain, and you may have the desire to get rid of the pain, but you may be a masochist. And the masochist in some way enjoys this, so he doesn't want to get rid of the pain. And there may be other situations, for instance, you are a young boy, and you have heard young boys don't cry, and they don't care if they feel pain. So you will show no pain behavior. But the cognitive function of the pain, of course, you have this bad feeling and you want to get rid of it, but you can't show any kind of behavioral indication for that. Okay, so that's the claim. The negative character of pain experience entails an urge to avoid. And that's a direct connection between the phenomenal aspect and the functional aspect. Now, if this is true, if there is this direct connection, then we should, which can be experienced from the first-person perspective. How much time do I have? I'm the chair, but I think we are 10 minutes late, so I should have 10 minutes left. Could that be? Okay, great. Okay. If the urge to avoid is a feeling that includes a disposition, then we should be aware of that. Then this feeling and this connection should have left some traces in our culture. And I think it has. So, I mean, only think of Nietzsche's description of bad and positive emotion. The bad emotions are those you want to get rid of, and the good emotions are those that you want to stay. And pain is one of these bad emotions. Woo hence says go, and joy wants eternity, wants deep, and deep eternity, that's Zarathustra. Or another good example would be intuitive example. Yeah, don't get me wrong, it's only anecdotal evidence. But if my claim is right, there has to be this kind of anecdotal evidence. Let me, once again. As you'll see, I have some problems with it. Okay, the second piece of evidence I should expect to be able to present, if it's really true that the bad character of pain experience is intrinsically connected with the disposition to avoid, then this dissociation thought experiment that we can do with colors and with consciousness in general, where you have a significant change on the phenomenal level without any change on the physical and functional level, they should not work with pain. And that's what I want to show. Now, think about, let's do a thought experiment. So inverted pain experiment. So it's like the inverted spectrum experiment. So you have two physically and functionally identical babies, and they have a pain-pleasure inversion. So one of these babies feels pain when they have a tissue damage and feels pleasure when they get hugged by their caretaker. And the other one, in the other case of the other one, it's just the opposite. The other one feels terrible pain or has a negative feeling when they get hugged by the caretaker, and they feel pleasure when they have a tissue damage. Now imagine these babies get hugged by their caretaker, and by premise, one will feel pleasure and the other one will feel terrible pain. What do you expect what is going to happen? Do you expect that the baby with a pain-pleasure inversion who feels terrible pain will cheer, will be happy? That seems to be completely unintuitive. So and if it is true that we expect that the baby that feels pain shows some kind of pain behavior, then we have the intuition that there is this that there is a significant connection between feeling and function, also from the first-person perspective. Okay, that's the intuitive or anecdotal evidence. Again, I don't think it's very strong, but it also shows that in the explanatory gap argument, they never did the inversion thought experiment with pain. They only did it with the color, and color is a very specific case, and with consciousness, we have no clear-cut idea of consciousness. And in the case of color experience wouldn't work if we would have that direct direction between behavior and experience. I mean, you couldn't. What would we do with for instance, the traffic lights? Yeah, it's an essential part of color that they can be coded in completely different ways on the behavioral level. They are flexible, and that's why these thought experiments. Okay, let me go to the empirical evidence. Just a very, very short primer with respect to pain. Pain seems to be homogeneous experience, but in fact, pain results from the activity of two distinct systems which have been invented at different times in the evolution. The one that came earlier is the affective motivational. The two systems are the affective motivational and the sensory system, and they differ regarding phenomenality, functional, and the underlying neural mechanism. The sensory system is the one that comes later in evolution, and it gives you information or lets you feel the place and the sort of the sensory of the tissue damage. And the neural mechanism is the somatosensory cortex that you find here, and the nerves, that is the A delta fibers. So that's what you find here. And then the second system is the affective motivational system. That is responsible for the unpleasant character of pain. And the neural mechanism is the anterior cingulate cortex, that's here or there. And the nerve system is the C fiber system. There was the philosophical legend in the 1950s and 60s that C fiber firing is pain. That's a crazy idea, yeah. It's only the efferent nerves of the pain system. Okay, now, because there are these two systems, and the affective system that is the subject of my claim can be stimulated independently of the sensory system, we can test the claim that I'm making. So, of course, if the affective system is not active, then I might feel pain, sensory pain, but not affective pain. Pain should not feel bad. And that is something that results from empirical studies, for instance, from a study by Rainville and colleagues. They did a selective experimental blocking of affective pain by hypnosis. And it turned out that the subject said, well, I still feel pain, but it doesn't feel bad again. And that becomes even more evident in a larger study by Berthier et al. With 6 patients with so-called pain asymbolia. Pain asymbolia, again, is a condition, in most cases because of a lesion in the anterior cingulate cortex, where you feel pain, but not affective pain. So you have pain experience without the affective character. So, and what turns out, these 6 patients first lack affective pain. They lack negative emotion. And that's what you will see there is a quote from the study. Inappropriate emotional reactions were common among these patients who didn't feel the negative aspect. 4 patients smiled or laughed during the pain testing procedure. None of them became anxious or angry during the pain testing procedure. None of them reported any unpleasant feeling. The first important point is they don't have the affective experience. Now, if they don't have the affective experience, and what I said is true, then it should have clear behavioral consequences. And there are these behavioral consequences. They show a complete lack of avoidance behavior, in one case, even a lack of approach behavior. So all 6 patients showed a lack of response to painful stimuli applied over the entire body. Neither superficial nor deep pain stimulation elicited a mouth withdrawal. 1 patient exhibited a reaction of approach to the painful stimuli. And that means, how much time do I have left? Pietro, how much time do I have left? Not very much. Okay, I stop here. Okay, so I stop here. So I wanted to show first that one of the basic problems in the discussion on consciousness is the connection between qualitative experience and function behavior. I tried to show that pain is a good example. My hypothesis was that there is a close connection between negative pain experience and avoidance. That I argued that this is plausible from the first person perspective. Negative pain experience implies the disposition or the desire to get rid of the pain experience. And then I tried to show that this is reflected in thought experiment, which reflects the intuitive part, and also in empirical evidence from pain research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, first of all, for this kind of invitation to Pietro, Riccardo, Dimitri, and all the organizers of this beautiful meeting. I think that Gustav Fechner, who was the founder of psychophysics, was the first to argue that if the corpus callosum, the large bundle of fibers that connect the left and the right side of the brain, was severed, that the outcome would be a body in which there would be 2 separate minds, essentially duplicated, maybe also 2 separate streams of consciousness. And this idea and this purely hypothetical thought experiment immediately met opposition and controversy. For instance, the British psychologist William McDougall, who was a dualist, by the way, argued that the mind would remain unified even if the 2 halves were separated. He actually asked the physiologist Sherrington to cut his corpus callosum if he were to contract an incurable disease. Obviously, the surgery doesn't occur in the case of McDougall, but it occurred several years after, and that was done by Joseph Bogen in Los Angeles to treat people with severe form of epilepsy. And Roger Sperry conducted seminal work about these patients that underwent complete section of the callosum. Of course, the kind of argument and evidence that can be obtained from this condition is controversial because these are pathological conditions. And the same is true for other examples of multiple minds in single bodies, which are related, for instance, to multiple personalities or other. But quite interestingly, the condition of split brain could be observed in natural condition in some animal species. So I'm not pretty sure that is relevant in any way to consciousness, but I think it would be interesting to discuss this kind of evidence and data. So, for instance, the large part of vertebrates with laterally placed eyes, for instance, fish, reptiles, and birds, don't have any callosum, which is a characteristic of mammals, actually of advanced mammals, the placental mammals. And you can see here a representation, a schematic representation of the two main visual pathway in the vertebrate brains. And what is relevant with respect to birds is that there is complete decussation at the optic chiasma, and also the two pathways. One is the thalamofugal, basically from the retina to the thalamus and then to the striate cortex in mammalian brain, for instance. The other is from the retina to the optic tectum, the colliculus in the mammalian brain, and then to the extrastriate part of the brain. And you can see that most of the fiber are shunned and fed the contralateral structure in the brain. There is some recrossing, in fact, in the avian brain. Here, there's a little amount of fibers from the thalamus to the contralateral hemisphere, and a little bit of commissure at the optic tectum level, connecting the tectum with an area, the nucleus rotundus in the thalamus. But most importantly, there are no connection between homologous regions at the level of the telencephalon. So there is no any callosum or equivalent of the callosum. And this has made possible to obtain a variety of evidence in these animals with concerning the different specialization of the left and right side of the brain by simply occluding temporary one eye, which is a non-invasive procedure. But I don't want to discuss the fact that the two sides of the brain perform different tasks, because this is very well known, but to attract your attention to some strange, weird results that emerged from this kind of research. For instance, consider this task that we performed some years ago with chicks. Chicks are trained to find some food by ground scratching on the floor for reward, and the position of the food is indicated by two cues simultaneously. That is, there is a conspicuous landmark, say a red stick, and also the position, in this case, the central position in the arena. And after chicks have learned the task, the landmark is displaced in this way to a corner, for instance. So the chick is faced with a sort of dilemma, conundrum, that is, should I search in the center with respect to the allocentric information of the arena, or should I use the local landmark to search for food close to the red stick? And what happens if you look at the result? First, look at the results for the monocular condition. This is training, they learn very easily. And then this is test with only the left or only the right eye in use. So this means mainly involving the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And the results are striking. That is, chicks using the left eye, the right hemisphere, go for the center. They search on the basis of geometrical spatial location. And chicks using the right eye, the left hemisphere, do the opposite. They search mainly close to the landmark. So they seem to use different strategies for orientation. But what you would expect about the binocular condition when both eyes are in use, and therefore there is the possibility to use information from both sides of the brain? Maybe confusion or maybe alternation between choice. Not at all. What is happening is shown here, and you can see that it is very similar to what happens in the left eye condition. So it seems that the point of view, the opinion of the right eye, left hemisphere, is completely ignored in the binocular seeing condition. You can say, well, it's not so strange that there are portions of the brain that operate in some way independently and there is no outcome in the behavior. But this is a curious condition because this is information feed in the eyes and therefore the information is coming in to both hemispheres, to both eyes, but in some way one portion is ignored. What is interesting is that this is not what happens in all conditions. In some conditions, there is, in some way, cross-talking about the hemisphere. For instance, we did some experiment in which we trained chicks without any landmark in an arena, for instance, for the middle position, and then they were tested for generalization in a large arena. And the black areas represent the area of maximal ground scratching. And you could see that there are two areas of ground scratch. One is in the center, and one is along this annulus that would represent the absolute metric distance as learned during training here in the smaller arena. So what happens when these tests are performed under monocular occlusion? Well, you can see the condition here. After training, in the binocular condition, there are two peaks. This is the case of a square-shaped arena rather than a triangular one, but it's basically the same. And you can see the two peaks, one in the center and one corresponding to the absolute metrics of the cage learned during training. And in the left eye condition, there is mostly searching in the center, whereas in the right condition, there is mostly searching at the absolute metric distances. So in this case, the binocular condition is representing both point of views of the brain, of the two hemispheres. Another example is shown here. This is a condition in which there is a rectangular arena, and chicks are trained to find in a corner a reward. And the reward is indicated both by geometrical information, the rectangular shape, and also by the landmarks located at the corners. If you remove the corners, you could expect completely random choice, but it is not if animals are able to encode geometric information. Geometric information would be that there will be two corners which are correct in principle, that is this one and the geometrically equivalent corners, that is the corner that have the same arrangement of surfaces, short on the right and long on the left, which is the same here, whereas corner B and D are certainly wrong. Okay, if you test animals in this condition, you can see that when they were using the left eye, search is mostly in the two correct locations. This is average with standard deviation, and very little search in the two geometrically incorrect locations. But with the right eye, see, search is completely random for all the corners. In the binocular condition, again, the situation is similar to the left eye. There seems to be some saying about the right eye, the left hemisphere, because there is an increase in errors, but actually is not significant. So some sort of midline condition. The same is true in other tasks, for instance, in working memory tasks in which chicks are trained to find a reward behind a panel, and the position of the panel in working memory can be remembered on the basis of the position, right, left, or on the basis of the object characteristics of the panel. So if you test them just for position cues, no differences between the monocular condition, object cues, no differences, addition of position and object-specific cues, no difference. But if there is a contrasting information, that is, if they learn, for instance, that the correct one is on the right and has a particular feature or configuration. And there's at this point, after the delay, on the right, there is the wrong object-specific panel, and on the left, the correct one. And so they are facing with the problem again to choosing object-specific or position-specific cues. The results show that the left eye, right hemisphere, and the binocular choose the spatial position, whereas the right and left hemisphere do the opposite. You can say, well, that is something that can be observed only for cognitive aspect, visual information, for instance, but it is not so. It is true also for more emotional and motivational aspects of behavior. This is not my data, but data from my friend Leslie Rogers from some years ago. She injected glutamate into the left or the right hemisphere of young chicks. This is a neuromediator, but at a certain dosage it could be neurotoxic. And there are five conditions, one without treatment, saline in both hemispheres, glutamate in the left, in the right, or in both hemispheres. And the measurement refer to the degree of attack behavior and also copulatory responses that can be evoked very early, very precociously in this species. And the results are in some ways surprisingly, because you could observe that injection into the left hemisphere make a lot of aggressive and copulatory responses. So you can say, well, the right hemisphere is producing this. And this would be in agreement with the fact that lesion to the right and lesion to both hemispheres make lower level of both behavior. But look at the condition in which there is no treatment at all, or saline condition. And you can see that there is a low level of response in spite of the fact that the right hemisphere is operating in this condition. So this result suggests that in the normal binocular or untreated condition, what is happening is that the left hemisphere would exert an active inhibitory control on the right hemisphere, which otherwise would produce very strong copulatory and attack responses, which are under inhibitory control by the left hemisphere. Just let me a digression about this story of emotion and brain asymmetry in animals. Some years ago, I studied lateralization in tail wagging behavior in dogs. You can say this is weird stuff. It is indeed, but there was a theoretical reason for this investigation. The theoretical reason is that most of the work on brain asymmetry is associated with investigation of paired organs, like, say, the hands, the eyes, the ear. But of course, you can imagine mechanism of competition or cooperation between the left and the right side of the brain, even in the control of medial organs, such as the tail, for instance, or a tongue. And the case of the tail wagging is particularly interesting, obviously, because this is a behavior with a high communicative values in dogs. So what we did was dogs move the tail both to the left and to the right. But we can measure the relative amplitude of the movement when they are presented with stimuli with different emotional values. And so we presented the dogs in a control condition with their owner or with another human beings or with a cat, which is a potential prey, or without any stimulus, or with an unfamiliar dog with an aggressive attitude and posture. And what we found was that the amplitude of the tail wagging was higher to the right in the condition with the owner, the human beings, even with the cat. It doesn't seem significant, but this is a within-level design. There is a strong reduction, as expected, in the overall activity of tail wagging, but still a right bias. But the reverse is true without any stimulus or with the presentation of an unfamiliar dog. You can observe this in some breeds of dogs, even by the naked eye, in some condition. I don't think it's working. Yes. This is a reduced speed, and you can see that the tail is moving, touching the right flank, but not the left. Then the dog is presented with an unfamiliar dog, and you see the reduction in the overall amplitude, but also the fact that the bias is moving to the left in this case rather than to the right. Okay, that's important in principle with respect to emotion in animals. And a colleague at the Riken Institute, after the publication of the paper, sent me this cartoon in which it is argued that scientists found that dogs move the tail more to the right than to the left when they are happy, and they want to check on the Pocky dog, which is the common name for a dog in Japan, but obviously the dog would refuse to show its inner emotional life. Well, the interpretation of this result was quite straightforward in my idea. There are, by the rubrospinal tract, contralateral innervation of the mechanism controlling the movement of the tail. So an imbalance at the brainstem level due to the different emotional stimuli might produce relatively more moving to one side or to the other. The interesting thing is that if that asymmetrical aspect could be turned out to be a communicative value. That is, what happens if a dog is looking to a conspecific which is making more tail wagging to the left or to the right. And this was done more recently using stimuli in which we have movies with prevalent right wag or prevalent or no wag at all, or prevalent left wag presented to the animals, both naturalistic and also with a silhouette like this one. And this time we measure behavior, but also some physiological responses, such as heart rate. I can show you a video of the behavior of the animals in this condition, which is striking. You can see that when they are looking at the right wagging, they are attentive, but quite relatively relaxed and not disturbed at all. And then you will see the same dog is looking at the pattern with the left wagging. You see it shows some sign of being disturbed, and then he moved away. And this was observing in most of the dogs we tested, and the results for the heart rate and also a variety of behavioral measures associated with relax or stress, anxiety, and alerting behavior show a striking differences between the two conditions of stimulation. Of course, you can say it could be that this is simply the results of attention to one hemifield, similar to the effects that have been described by Julian James in the famous happy or sad faces. But the point is that the left hemisphere is mainly connected with the right side of the brain, which would be involved with just negative emotion, not just positive emotion. By the way, I missed the opportunity to become a rich and famous scientist because a colleague of mine alerted me some years after that an American company devised a gadget to measure dogs' happiness by making use of our procedure. They quoted us, of course, but they don't provide us with any royalties for that. I'm not sure it is working properly. Anyway, the kind of phenomena I have described are probably quite common, not just in vertebrates, but also in invertebrates with completely nervous systems. For instance, recently with Alex Schnell, a colleague in Cambridge, we did some work with cuttlefish, and we presented cuttlefish in an environment in which the background and the rest of the environment was characterized by different brightness, as shown here, in such a way that one eye is looking at mainly a brighter area or to a darker one. You can expect that they make some sort of averaging, but in fact, it is visible maybe even from the photographs that what is important is stimulation of the right eye, which is taking control in some way, because when the right eye is receiving more bright information, more bright light, there is more bright in the mantle than in the reverse condition, and this is shown here. The case of invertebrates is particularly puzzling for me because it is associated also with moving of memories between the two hemispheres, which are not so easy to integrate with evidence for specialization of one side of the brain for one function or the other, and the kind of experience that the animal could have at the start and at the end of the learning procedure. I don't know whether you are familiar with the procedure of Pavlovian conditioning using the Probowski's extension reflex. So basically, it is shown here. There is a shunt, an odor which is presented to the animal, and then sugar solution as the unconditioned stimulus, and this produces extraflexion of the ligula. And a few pairing of this kind, just 3-4 trials are enough to produce in subsequent tests in which only the shunt is presented, the extraflexion of the ligula is going on without any sugar solution presented in this case. So some years ago, with Srini Srinivasan and Leslie Rogers, we did some experiments in which we train bees in a biantennal condition, that is with both antennas in use, and then we cover with a silicone compound either the left or the right antenna, and we check for recall. And what we found was really striking in the sense that when both antennas were in use, recall 1 hour after, or the right antenna was in use, there was excellent recall. But when the left antenna alone was in use, there was completely loss of memory, apparently. So we investigated the basis of this phenomenon at different levels. First of all, we look at the number of sensilla, that is receptors which are there in the antenna, in the more rostral part, which is shown here. They can be seen easily at the electron microscopy because they have a characteristic shape, even beautiful. I show you just because they are wonderful. And we count the number of sensilla in the right and left antenna, and we found that in all segments there was a larger number of olfactory sensilla in the right antenna than in the left. Then we check for the responses of the neurons associated with this sensilla. This can be done with electroencephalography, which is similar to the EEG, basically. And if you look at the response in millivolt to different kinds of odorants like linalool and isomyl acetate, one is floreal and the other is a hormonal component, you see that there is stronger response in the right antenna. Similarly, if you move deeper into the brain and using two-photon microscopy, I don't know whether you are familiar with the brain of bees. This is the antenna, this is the antennal lobe, which is similar to the olfactory lobe of the mammalian brain with glomeruli. And then there are interneurons going to the mushroom body, which is a sort of associative cortex in the brain of bees. And we recorded the activity of this when puff of shunt were presented. And you can see responses of single neurons, which are higher to the odorant in the right, in the neuron in the right side rather than in the left side. So far so good. It seems that there are asymmetry at different levels of the nervous system, can explain the fact that memory is better in the right hemisphere than in the left. But what is puzzling is that if you look at the memory, at the recall, at different time interval, this is the pattern that we have got. And this is the laterality index. And the first response is the one I mentioned before, 1 hour after training, so dominant right antenna. Then at about 3 hours, no differences in the recall. And then after 6 hours, no chance probably is the time for needed for protein synthesis and formation of long-term memory. The memory seems to be moved to the other hemisphere, to the left side of the brain. So one alternative point of view about this story is obviously that the split brain, or the natural split brain, has a single stream of mind, consciousness, as you want, whose physical basis shift from one hemisphere to the other from moment to moment as a function of which hemisphere has momentarily won the battle for attentional resources. So there will be no really two mind, but a continuous shifting in which hemisphere is in control. This is an interesting idea, I think, and could be extending to another idea, even more interesting. That is, it could be, and that I think is a popular point of view in philosophy, that the part of the material basis for the mind can be external to the body. And therefore, that the left-right coordination in split brain can be achieved by cross-cueing. That is, behaviors such as head movement that share information across the two sides. And so, in this regard, the corpus callosum could be considered as a sort of internal information sharer, while other cross-cueing could be considered an external one. Obviously, cross-cueing could be deliberate, under control of the subject, but it also can become subpersonal. Two examples of this. This is work we have done with dogs. And dogs, when they are tested with scent by this small tube, show a classical scanning movement, alternating the use of the right and the left nostril. And what we found is that this alternation is not random, actually, and using different kind of scent of odorants over extended period of trial stimulation, these are several weeks, you can see that at the start, when the stimulus is novel, there is mainly use of the right nostril, and then slowly the involvement is prevalently to the left nostril. This is true for most of the odorant, apart from those which are extremely important, of large valence. For instance, the odor of the vet or the odor of the adrenaline. In this case, the use of the right nostril seems to be quite constant and consistent over time. And the other example is again for chicks, and we have now with machine learning techniques to look at the use of the right and left eye and the use of the frontal and the lateral visual field in controlled condition when they are looking at stimuli, for instance, an imprinting object. And what is fascinating is that they are actively using the right or the left eye depending on the kind of stimulus. For instance, if it is an imprinting object, they start with the right eye and then they turn to use of the left. But if it is an object which is novel with respect to the imprinting object, they start with the other eye or vice versa. And this is under immediate control. So perhaps they start with random scanning, and then one hemisphere is taking charge, is taking control of behavior. The conclusion is not terribly exciting, I think, I'm afraid, but I think evidence from natural split brain is not providing clear clues to the question that oppose Fechner and McDougall. And there are several possible interpretations for this data. Perhaps two minds are really present. Perhaps the transition between ordinary life and the special circumstances of experiment produces a switching between the two minds and one. Perhaps a single mind is always present, but it is switches between hemispheres. We don't know. Thank you for your attention.
So I'm going to talk about 10 years of research, studies, and theorizing that my colleagues and I have done on the issue of the relation between reading fiction and mostly mentalizing, but here today I focus primarily on emotional consciousness. So I'll start by defining very briefly the two main constructs here. Of course, the first one is very simple, fiction. We all know what it is about. I would argue fiction is narrative as opposed to expository. And of course, narrative is any account of a series of related events or experiences. And for instance, you can think about the dichotomy proposed by many, among others, Brunner, and his narrative versus paradigmatic way of thinking. And of course, the narrative writing is what I'm focusing on. As far as emotional consciousness is concerned, of course, I basically consider it synonymous of the conscious experience of an emotion. And I will focus both on this conscious experience when it comes to ourselves, what we experience about our own emotions, and also that of others. And of course, this dualism, a very different kind of dualism that we've been discussing so far, some of you may argue is not really related to consciousness, but I will use Nick's words that at some point somewhere said something like, the crucial thing about consciousness is not that I feel, therefore I am, but that you feel, and therefore you are too, with a host of implications from the philosophical to the political of such a statement. So just briefly, I will mention that what I'm talking about today is at best consciousness with a small c, not the kind of consciousness that have been discussed so far. I will be talking mostly not about its genesis or its nature, as it has been, many of you have done beautifully and in a very interesting manner over the last few days. But I'm going to talk about its training to some extent. And what I mean is what makes us good at it. Some may argue that it's an impossible idea or a stupid idea to think about it. We can train consciousness, but when you think about consciousness with a small c, perhaps that makes sense. And I will focus, as you will see, primarily when I talk about emotion recognition, in the accuracy with which we recognize emotions. Again, both in ourselves and in others. So I will start from the very beginning. I usually think it's a good idea to start from early on and with our ancestors, and primarily with the wonderful paper published just a year after I started my research program in 2014 by Polly Wisner, who's an anthropologist at the University of Utah, who spends a lot of time in Papua New Guinea observing the life of various tribes. And in a wonderful article, the title of which is The Embers of Society, she talks about the implications and the consequences of man's discovery of fire, and particularly the control of fire. And so she obviously interprets or draws conclusion about these implications by looking at what the behavior of these tribes in Papua New Guinea, and particularly what happens after sunset. And she basically says the stories, which I consider, we can consider as synonymous of fiction for today, describe the works of entire institution in small-scale society with little formal teaching, of course, and that's what we also think our ancestors did for tens of thousands of years. So she argues that night talk, which it is the kind of talk that happens around the fire at night, plays an important role in conveying attributes of people in broad networks that she calls virtual communities, that transmit the big picture about the cultural institutions that generate regularity of behavior, cooperation, trust at the regional level, which are all very important features that we think have characterized our evolutionary history and contributed to make us the social animal that we are. Interestingly, she also mentions that the storytelling and the story listening contribute to evoke higher orders, the theory of mind processes through the process of imagination. And most of my work over the last 10 years has been on this concept of theory of mind, which we can quickly define as the capacity to infer and represent other people's mental state, including, of course, emotions. So, as been argued by many, Boyd, Gottschalk wrote a wonderful book called The Storytelling Animal. Of course, Nick in the 1980s discussed this, that stories teach us about the world. They teach us, are important to make us learn about the world, not only about the content, but how we learn how to learn. We learn about others, and of course, we learn about ourselves. And that's really the main, an idea that has been proposed by many, and for which cognitive scientists have, in the last couple of decades, devoted some specific attention to try to support it empirically by looking at some of the things that we may learn by reading or listening to stories. So what is the evidence? I'll start with a series of studies that are approximately 20 years old, not mine, in which that first try to see whether there is a relation between how much fiction people read and their capacity, their emotion recognition capacity, primarily towards the emotions of others. And they measure fiction reading. There is many ways to do it, and one of them, the most used, is this auto-recognition test. The auto-recognition test is, as the name suggests, you present participants with a long list of names. Half of them are names of authors of fiction. There are different versions of the auto-recognition test. This one is particularly about fiction. Half of them are foils, so that to avoid that people simply pretend to know a lot and click a lot of names. So this is just a way to control for that. And so they measure, let's call it exposure to fiction, this way, and then they measure emotional recognition, or so known as theory of mind, through the reading the mind in the eyes test. It's until recently, or still to some extent, the most widely used measure of emotional recognition / mentalizing capacity. The RMET consists of a series of pictures of the eye region. There are 36 of them in the complete test, and is presented one at a time to participants, and your task is always to guess which emotion, they're not all quite emotions, but what mental state or emotion the person is experiencing. And there is a correct answer. We could devote an entire workshop on whether there is a correct answer, but we will accept that there is one and move on. That has been used as a performance measure of emotion recognition. So what do they find in these earlier studies? That the more fiction people read, the better they are at this task, controlling for a variety of things you may think about, the covariates of education, intelligence, gender, socioeconomic status, and so on, personality traits, and so on and so forth. This correlation remains. Most recently, about a few years ago, Schwering, Polan-Identhal, and others conducted another study that more specifically and directly measured people's ability to recognize emotion using a dynamic measure of emotion recognition, which is the GERT, the Geneva Emotion Recognition Test. Instead of eye region, pictures of eye region, participants see short videos. And in this case, too, they have to indicate which emotion is expressed by the person in the video. There are simple emotions and more complex emotion in this video, in this set. And of course, there is here, too, a correct answer we take for granted. And what they find here is, as you can see, both for simple emotion and complex emotion, there is a somewhat linear trend, positive relationship, fairly similar to what has been observed for several years between the reading fiction and performance on the emotion recognition test by the RMET. So overall, a positive relation between reading fiction and emotion recognition. What is the explanation for this? Early on, fairly vague explanation were proposed, some sort of simulation that reading fiction is a simulation of social life, and therefore you get better at it. That was 20 years ago. Raymond Marr, Keith Oatley, more or less argue for this. Most recently, Schwering in their later paper argues something a little bit more specific. They say that reading fiction improves emotion recognition because there is a lot of words in fiction that denote emotions. And so they say two processes are possible. One is embodied simulation. You read a lot about words that are emotion words, and therefore you embody this emotion. Or via category learning, simply by listening, being exposed to a lot of emotion words, you refine your concepts and you get better at it. They also present in the same study where they present the video, the GERT data, they present the corpus analysis, and they found that fiction has more emotion words than nonfiction. Not a very surprising finding, right? A computer manual is much less likely to have emotion words than a novel. But the idea that this is it's not clear why the correct comparison in this case is nonfiction, but the evidence, that's what they've been proposing. I found this unsatisfying. In fact, I found it unsatisfying before it was published because I started working on this in about 2011. But here's why I find it unsatisfying. First of all, emotion labels, emotion words are fairly abstract words. But we know that embodied simulation and embodied process are more likely to be prompted by concrete words as opposed to abstract words. Second, the category learning, so the other explanation they propose, which is consistent with both of them are consistent with the high frequency of emotional words in fiction. The category learning explanation implies a fairly passive learning process that in psychology for about 100 years has been questioned in psychology, from Vygotsky to Dewey and so on, Piaget and so on and so forth. So in parallel to this, in previous about 10 years, my colleagues and I have been working on the idea that accurate emotional consciousness vis-a-vis ourselves or others is a capacity that needs training, implying a much more active process through which we can refine and train this capacity that we all, more or less, we think, come into the world with, the potential for it. So that's why I'm bringing you back now 20 years first, not my work at first, but a wonderful study conducted by two Canadian developmental psychologists that did an intervention in schools with very young children, age 5, preschool, I guess. And they read story to them. They read two different kinds of story. This is the same story. The title is Toby, Where Are You? These are children from 5 years old, stories. Toby is hiding from his mother and father. He has taken his puppet's hand with him under the bed. Toby's father looks for Toby in the toy box. He does not find Toby there. Toby's mother looks for Toby under the sheets, as she does not find Toby there either. Toby's mother and father call out Toby's name. Where could he possibly be? They just have to keep looking. That's one version of the story that was read to children. But to the other half of the children, randomly allocated, of course, as in every good experiments, they were read a different version of this story, which is actually the original version of the book, of the children's book. And as you can see, I'm not going to read it all because we lost enough time this morning. But as you can see, I highlighted in italic, conveniently for you, metacognitive verbs. As you can see, he thinks, he won't know, the father remembers, and so on and so forth. These words had been taken out from the authors in a series of stories, here's one example, to produce the version to the left. Okay, so children were read actually 6 books over several weeks, all of one kind or all of the other kind. Okay, so they were basically trained with stories that contained a lot of metacognitive words or with stories that didn't contain any metacognitive words. Quite counterintuitively, in fact, that's not what the experimenters expect. Sorry, one more detail. 4-week-long intervention, 2 groups, of course, as I just mentioned. Either they read one version or the other, and then they completed a theory of mind task, which is the Annie false belief test. So this is not a motion task, but it's considered a test of theory of mind. So it's still like about understanding what goes on or guessing what is in another person's mental state. And what they found was that children who were read for 4 weeks, implicit versions, meaning versions of the books where there were no metacognitive words, they actually outperformed children that had been read books with the metacognitive words. This is a counterintuitive findings for many reasons. There is a lot of research showing that when children are read or spoken to with metacognitive words, it's actually an important step in development because they learn about emotions. But it looks like once they know the words, actually their absence more than their presence triggers this training of this capacity of mental state recognition, and I would argue also emotions in a similar manner. So back to 2013, that's when my former student David Kidd and I published the first evidence for this research program. We studied the effect of reading in adults, not with children, the effect of reading literary or popular fiction on mentalizing capacity, theory of mind processes, emotion recognition. I'm not going to bother you with too many details. In the first experiment first article that we published, we had 5 experiments in which we compared various conditions. LF is for literary fiction, of course. Sometimes you compare it to popular fiction. Sometimes you compare it to non-fiction. Sometimes you compare it to another grouping that read nothing at all. So these are not children that are being read to, adults that read for about 20 minutes, either a short story or an excerpt of a novel over the first 20, more or less 20 pages that we previously categorized as literary popular fiction. And this distinction is highly controversial And I will explain a little bit more as I go along, and then over lunch, you please feel free to come and bother me to provide you more justification for the distinction. And at one level, it's very intuitive. At another level, it's important to operationalize, to provide a good operationalization of it. So we basically, we used in this first set of studies over 10 years ago, we used the National Book Award winner novels or short stories that have been classified as literary fiction and their equivalent in popular fiction. For instance, New York Times bestseller are considered popular, but they could not have won an award, and vice versa, a book that won a National Book Award, but was never a top seller on the New York Times best-selling list. After that, we made them read, they did the same task that the previous studies done. What do we find? As I probably saw in the previous slides, we used many different measures of mentalizing. One of them is the reading the mind, the eyes test, which for today is perhaps the most pertinent because it's really an emotion recognition test. And so I'll show you just one graph of the results of the 5 experiments and many variables. What we find is that after reading literary fiction, participants performed better at this task. They recognized emotions in others better. More accurately than people that either had read popular fiction or that had not read anything at all, or nonfiction, and so on and so forth. So this is one example of this, but we repeated this pattern again and again. Over the years, mostly replicated, some failed replication, but replicated many times by also in other labs, also in different countries. So those were experiments, which are interesting, of course, to prove some sort of causality, right? We could show that it's not like people liked literary fiction, therefore they're better to your mind. In experiments, you kind of know that you allocate them randomly. So if you made them read that kind of fiction and you find that they perform better, the reason is that because they read that kind of fiction, not because of their preferences. However, we also conducted correlational studies similar to what I presented before, the earlier studies on the auto-recognition test that I just presented to you. So what we did, however, we used the same instrument, but instead of computing one single score to see how much fiction the participants had read, or at least familiarity with fiction, we computed 2 on the basis of extensive factual analytical work that suggested the presence of really 2 factors in the auto-recognition test. As you can probably immediately see, the authors to the left are what we consider literary authors, and the authors on the right are popular fiction authors. And we repeated this with large data set that we collected over the years and finding a fairly clear structure. What do we find is that, in fact, the relationship between reading fiction and emotion recognition skills only holds for recognizing or being familiar with or reading literary fiction, not popular fiction. As you can see, there is no correlation whatsoever, and we replicated this finding several times. These are 2 of the articles in which, multiple studies article in which we reported this. Also, as you know, it is expensive and time-consuming to collect data. So when Schwering and Ponalidenthal published 2 years ago their finding with the ERT and the emotion recognition test with the GERT, we asked them for their data that they kindly share with us, and so we reanalyzed them. Right? You remember they found a relation between being familiar with fiction and emotion recognition score. But we divided them into, both for complex and simple emotion, what we find is exactly what we found years prior in our own studies, meaning that it's only familiarity or reading literary fiction that is associated with better performance on the GERT, this dynamic measure of emotion recognition, the videos, right? And this also both complex and simple emotion. So what we have so far is that we have experimental evidence, important, and the correlational evidence, in which I didn't bother with the details, but we also use the customary covariates to assure, or at least to try to control for as many other variables as possible. Also using either static, the RMET, pictures of individuals, or dynamic measures of emotion recognition, such as the GERT. And also we found, as I anticipated, mentioned briefly, we don't find only this on emotion recognition, but we find these effects specific to literary fiction on other measures of theory of mind or mentalizing that are more cognitive in nature than the RMET or the GERT. Now, what about, I started out by saying emotion consciousness and being conscious of our own emotion, of that of others and of our own. Now, Paul earlier on this morning mentioned, it's by default we are good at, or at least there is no other judge for what we are experiencing than ourselves, right? So to have a performance measure of emotion recognition for the self, I cannot imagine one. But recently, there was an article, well, not that recent, 5 years ago now, 7 years ago now, that looked at alexithymia. Some of you may be familiar with the term. It's considered a condition, a clinical condition. Literally means the lack of words for emotion, since research was started in the 1970s on this. And it's considered a deficient development of conscious awareness of our own emotion, right? This time not of that of other. So I maybe experience the emotion, but I'm not able to understand what it is, to label it, to accurately be conscious of it. That's the way it has been understood. And somewhere, and colleagues have published an article showing here too, in this case, a negative correlation between reading fiction and alexithymia, right? It's the opposite. Alexithymia is coded, so the high value is basically a deficit in emotion awareness, and therefore we expect a negative correlation. And they indeed find this negative correlation. Here too, you may wonder if I ever collect my own data, but here too, we asked for the data, and they also kindly shared the data with us recently. And we reanalyzed them in this case as well. What do we find? Well, alexithymia is negatively related only to reading literary fiction. If anything, there is a quite almost significant trend for a positive relation between reading popular fiction and alexithymia. So this, broadly, the interpretation of this is if you read a lot of literary fiction, you're less likely to be alexithymic. If you read more popular fiction, if anything, you're more likely. Not quite strong, as you can see, right? But very clear dissociation between the two patterns, very similar and coherent with what we find with the recognition of emotion in others. Again, the measure of alexithymia is not a performance measure. It's a scale that people report how good they are, how much they can feel and understand their emotion. So but it's as good as it gets, I think, unless you have some ideas here to measure to what extent we are conscious of our own emotion. Of course, the alexithymia score and the RMET are negatively correlated, right? We know that the capacity to understand our own emotion is correlated with the capacity to understand other people's emotion. This long theorized, some evidence for this we do find. In the reanalysis of their data, we also found this evidence. So just to briefly recap, we saw in the 2004 article by Peskin and Astington, the beautiful article with children, that it was a book with no mental state words that led to greater theory of mind development in children, at least in the context of the study. Maybe development, I should not have used the word development here, but stronger effect over several weeks period. We also find, we had been finding for years that reading literary fiction uniquely leads to greater emotion recognition, both in others and maybe to some extent we can see with the alexithymia finding in ourselves. So one of the questions is that we asked when this first article arguing that it was emotion, the presence of emotion in fiction that was facilitating emotion recognition in readers, is whether literary fiction contained fewer emotion words, not more, than popular fiction, given the dissociation that we found. And kind of a parallel question was if it contains fewer emotion labels, let's say, does it convey emotion implicitly in another manner? Of course, we all know anybody who reads fiction or study fiction, all the literary studies tell you how key emotional experience is in reading, right? And in watching movies, by the way, but we will maybe get to that later. So what we did was starting a corpus analysis. We created two corpuses, one in Italian, one in English, with hundreds of novels that we categorized with the same criteria that we used before as literary or popular, and we started looking at differences. One of the reasons why I started this is because when presenting this work all over the world, and particularly in France, I was accused of being a reactionary for proposing this distinction between literary and popular fiction. So that the distinction was actually amounted to nothing. And so I started looking for objective indicators of difference. And we published a couple of things, but we'll look at, I'll present here very briefly a few findings. First of all, we look at explicit and implicit emotionality of text. I'm not going to go into details of the computational linguistic tools that we did not have in 2012, David Kidd and I, when we started this work, but in the meantime have been developed, and therefore we're taking advantage of it. You can easily now count the emotion words in the text, of course, but also measure how they convey emotion implicitly without using emotion words, okay? And here's what we find. So we compare literary text to popular fiction to literary fiction. And in this case, I'm going to present the probability that the text is literary, so one is literary, or popular, depending on the amount of implicit and explicit emotion that the text contains. And what we find is that the more explicit emotion there are, the less likely it is that the work is literary fiction. On the other hand, the more implicit emotionality they have in the text, in the language, the more likely it is that they are literary fiction texts. So clearly a dissociation here too. You remember that one of the explanations about embodiment, which is one of the accounts that has been proposed to explain why fiction facilitates emotion recognition, and we, of course, we moderated that by saying it's not only literary fiction, is the concreteness, right? The concrete language. So we look at concreteness, another easy thing to do now with today's computational tools, and the more concrete language a text has, the more likely it is that the text is literary as opposed to fiction. And I think I have a quote here, Anton Chekhov, of course, famously said, although it looks like he never said this, but it doesn't really matter. Don't tell me the moon is shining, which a popular text would do. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. And this makes me think about what Nick said earlier about art, and maybe I saw too much of a parallel because I want to, but I think what he said today earlier about how art does not reproduce reality, but hints at it, and gives a suggestion or presents alternative version of it, is not dissimilar to this in the sense that when you present abstract representation of the world, including mental state of others, emotions, and so on and so forth, you're already giving the result to the reader or to the viewer in case of movies, whereas when you hint at something, you give obscure, opaque representation of it, you allow to the reader or to viewer, actually you force them to make the cognitive and affective work to inferential work that we think is related to the development of this emotion recognition capacity. Finally, this is a most recent finding. Given all I said, we would expect that literary texts are less predictable than popular text. And of course, this too today is extremely easy to test using BERT, also legal BERT to the right. We use also legal because BERT is likely to have read a lot of the novels, right? So we have to be careful. By BERT, you probably all know what I'm talking about. It's a large language model. And the dependent variable is the predictability of the next word or the next sentence across the hundreds of books in our corpus. And as you can see, there is a clear difference between the two. Popular texts are more predictable than literary. Popular fiction is more predictable than literary fiction, which is almost a cliche of the cliche, right? So I'm almost done. So what can we conclude? Clearly, it seems after 10 years of research in my lab and others that reading literary fiction specifically enhances emotion recognition in others, and perhaps, as we've seen with the Lexitamer findings, also in ourselves. And the two are related. I mean, there's a missing D there, as we've seen. The recognizing other people's emotion is related to how much we think we can understand our own emotion, unsurprisingly. More broadly, we do find that reading literary fiction sharpens our capacity to attend to mental states of others or metacognitive abilities. And by the way, also our films do the same effect. I did not present the findings here, but we have very parallel patterns when we, instead of asking people to read literary or popular fiction, we make them watch an art film or a Hollywood film. Very similar pattern of finding. We also find plenty of differences in the language, in the lexicon, the syntax, the structure of these two corpus, popular fiction, corpora, popular fiction, and literary fiction. And this begins to provide some support for ideas we published in 2013 when we argue that we had these effects. We were hypotheses about how to explain them, but we did not have the tools to test a lot of the differences that we now are able to test. So we do find, and in fact participants also report this, that the characters of literary fiction are more opaque, there is more uncertainty about everything, the plot, what's happening, what is in the mind of the characters, and so on and so forth. And we argue, we believe that this triggers inferential processes about the mind. And also here's a link with what Nick mentioned earlier about art. What we think is at work is a process of imagination more than a process of identification. And this can be perhaps best understood if we think of movies that are increasingly, especially what we call Hollywood movies, increasingly you are brought into the perspective of the character. You live almost first person. Whereas in the art film is almost the opposite, right? You're much more likely to be an observer. And so the first ones are more likely, I think, to prompt identification and maybe a strong feeling of emotion, the same emotion that the characters are experiencing, but through an immediate embodied experience without, and here I will probably exaggerate, without necessarily developing the consciousness of it. Whereas in a literary text or in our film, you are more likely to be thinking metacognition processes about what the characters is thinking or experiencing, as opposed to experiencing directly with them, as it happens in Hollywood movies. Now, does this mean that it contributes to our consciousness? I will not dare to say yes or no. I will let you answer for yourself. Of course, there's a lot of links between this work and the idea of the development of consciousness and the role of storytelling in our evolutionary history. And so, many links with anthropological work, particularly on this. And most importantly, there are many loose ends on this research program that I'm sure you will highlight in the question session. Thank you.